In the heart of medieval Europe, the wealthy region of Flanders stood proud and independent. Bustling cities, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, were centers of trade and culture, rich from the wool industry. But beneath this prosperity simmered tension. The French crown, hungry for power, sought to tighten its grip. When the heavy hand of occupation crushed the freedoms of the Flemish people, rebellion ignited. In the dead of night, commoners armed with nothing but tools and courage rose against heavily armored knights. What followed was a battle unlike any other, a clash of wills that shook kingdoms and changed history forever. This is the story of the Bruges Matins and the Battle of the Golden Spurs, a fight for freedom, dignity, and the right to determine their own fate. In the year 1302, the county of Flanders was among the most prosperous regions in Europe. It was urban, densely populated, and economically powerful, thanks in large part to the booming textile industry. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres thrived on the wool trade. English wool was transformed into fine cloth, exported all over Europe. Flemish merchants grew rich. Guilds held real political influence, and the cities were proud of their autonomy. But prosperity had a price. Flanders was officially a vassal of the French crown. Its ruler, Count Guy of Dampierre, owed feudal allegiance to King Philip IV of France, a king known for his ambition, his cold calculation, and his hunger for control. Tensions had been rising for years. Count Guy tried to strengthen Flanders' position by negotiating a marriage alliance with England, France's enemy. That was all King Philip needed. In 1300, he summoned Guy to Paris under diplomatic pretenses. There, the Count was imprisoned, along with his sons. Philip declared Flanders under direct royal control. French soldiers were dispatched. A new governor, Jacques de Châtillon, was sent to rule from Bruges. The occupation began like many do, with promises and smiles. But very quickly, resentment spread. French officials seized property, levied new taxes, and quartered soldiers in Flemish homes. The merchants were squeezed, the guilds were humiliated, and the ordinary citizens were forced to pay for their own subjugation. Cultural tensions made things worse. French was the language of power. The Flemish dialect, the native tongue of the people, was mocked and excluded from legal matters. Anyone who dared speak out was labeled a rebel. Anyone who resisted risked prison, or worse. Jacques de Châtillon, the French governor, surrounded himself with loyalists and foreign troops. He ignored the traditions of local governance. He revoked privileges long held by the cities. He made no effort to understand the Flemish people. To him, they were subjects, not citizens. The ruling class in Flanders began to split. Some nobles collaborated with the French, hoping to preserve their titles and lands. But the guilds, the heart of urban Flanders, had no such option. They were taxed, policed, and insulted daily. In Bruges, unrest turned into quiet rebellion. Small groups began meeting in secret. Not nobles, not soldiers, but blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, butchers. Ordinary men who had seen enough. They shared stories of humiliation, of French soldiers abusing townspeople, of taxes that made life unbearable. Underground networks formed. Taverns became safe houses. Messages were passed by candlelight. Weapons were smuggled under carts and wrapped in cloth. The guilds began preparing for something bold. They didn't have the power to negotiate. So they chose another path. A password was agreed upon: Schild en Vriend, shield and friend. Anyone who couldn't pronounce it correctly wasn't one of them. They would strike, not as an army, but as a people, one city, one cause, to take Flanders back. In the early hours of May 18th, 1302, the city of Bruges was quiet. The streets were dark, shutters were closed, but something was stirring beneath the silence. For weeks, rumors had spread. Resistance was growing. Guild members and townspeople were preparing to take back control. They knew that a direct attack on the occupying French forces would be suicide unless it was fast, brutal, and unexpected. The plan was simple. Strike before dawn, when the French would be asleep. Enter the homes and quarters where soldiers were housed. Identify friend from foe. With a single phrase, Schild en vriend. It was brilliant and merciless. The French garrison had no idea what was coming. At daybreak, armed Flemish citizens moved through the streets of Bruges. They carried axes, spears, butchers' knives, hammers, not military weapons, but tools of labor, turned into weapons of war. They knocked on doors, one by one. Anyone who answered was forced to repeat the password. If they pronounced it in the French way, Schild en vriend, their fate was sealed. Panic spread quickly. French soldiers woke up to shouting, to steal, to fire. Many were cut down in their beds. Others tried to flee but were caught in alleyways, dragged from hiding places, or stabbed in the streets. Some tried to surrender. It didn't matter. This was vengeance. This was payback for years of humiliation and repression. And the people of Bruges showed no mercy. Contemporary chronicles estimate that between 80 and 100 French soldiers were killed that morning, including several high-ranking officers. It was not a battle. It was a purge. The French governor, Jacques de Châtillon, barely escaped with his life. He fled the city, disguised, humiliated, and furious. He swore revenge and promised to return with a full army. But for the people of Bruges, that didn't matter yet. They had done something unthinkable. They had risen up and won. The Matins of Bruges, or Bruges Matins as they're called in Flemish, would become a symbol. A moment where ordinary citizens proved they could change the balance of power. A moment that turned rebellion into revolution. The city immediately closed its gates. French loyalists were hunted down. Militias were formed. Banners were raised. And word of the uprising spread like wildfire. Other cities, Ghent, Ypres, Kortrijk, began organizing their own defenses. And in the countryside, peasants joined the growing resistance. This was no longer about Bruges alone. This was the beginning of war. After the uprising in Bruges, there was no turning back. The people had taken a stand, and they knew what was coming next. France would return, with more men, more horses, and more rage than ever before. But something had changed. For the first time in years, the cities of Flanders stood united. The myth of French invincibility had been shattered. And across the region, citizens began preparing for war. From Bruges to Ghent, from Kortrijk to the smallest villages, militias were formed. Men who had never held a sword trained with wooden sticks and farming tools. Guilds supplied armor, sharpened weapons, and produced shields. Blacksmiths forged spearheads. Bakers supplied bread for the fighters. Even children carried water and messages between camps. This was not a professional army. It was a people's army, born out of necessity, fueled by fury, and united by purpose. Leadership emerged from the working class. Peter de Koninck, a weaver from Bruges, became one of the key figures of the revolt. He had already played a major role in the Matins. Now he stood as a commander. Jan Breidel, a butcher, joined him. strong, outspoken, and feared by the French. Breidel didn't speak like a noble, didn't act like one, but he fought like one. Together, they rallied the people, not through titles or birthright, but by example. Meanwhile, the French crown was preparing a response. King Philip IV was furious. The humiliation in Bruges had to be avenged. He ordered a massive army to be assembled. Nobles from all over France were called to arms. Heavy cavalry, the pride of medieval warfare, was placed at the center. Thousands of knights, heavily armored, mounted on trained war horses. They believed the rebellion would be crushed within days. Command was given to Robert II, Count of Artois, an experienced noble, proud, and arrogant. To him, the idea that commoners could defeat knights was laughable. His army marched north in full confidence, but the Flemish had no intention of meeting them head-on. They knew they couldn't win an open battle against cavalry in flat terrain, so they turned to strategy. The city of Kortrijk became the rallying point. It was close to the expected French route, and its marshy surroundings offered natural protection. The Flemish chose the fields near the river Groninge, soft, damp, and perfect for trapping horses. Over 9,000 Flemish soldiers gathered there. Many had no combat experience, but they were disciplined, organized into militia units by city and by trade. They trained to fight in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, spear to spear. Each line reinforced the next. Their main weapon? The Goedendag, a short spear with a deadly iron spike on top. Easy to carry, easy to thrust upward, into the belly of a charging horse, or into the joints of a knight's armor. They also dug ditches, broke up the soil, and flooded parts of the field. They turned the battlefield into a trap. But it wasn't just weapons and mud. It was morale. The Flemish were fighting for their homes, their families, and their future. No one expected them to win, not even some of their own allies. But in the eyes of the guilds, defeat was not an option, because if they lost, there would be no mercy. July 11th, 1302. The sun rose over the fields of Kortrijk, wet from the morning dew, quiet, still. But the ground would not stay silent for long. On one side, the French army, heavily armed, mounted knights in shining armor, banners fluttering in the wind, trumpets sounded. On the other, the Flemish militias. No horses, no nobles, just guildsmen and laborers standing shoulder to shoulder. They waited, silent, in tight formation. The French forces were confident. They had never lost to commoners before. Robert of Artois, the French commander, believed this would be easy, a display of royal power. He didn't wait. He ordered the crossbowmen forward, but they were quickly trapped. The marshy ground slowed their movement, and the Flemish replied with bolts of their own. The first clash was brief, and it didn't go the way Artois expected. Then came the full cavalry assault. Hundreds of knights charged, swords raised, hooves thundering across the plain. They were fast, loud, deadly. But the terrain betrayed them. What looked like open field was broken by ditches, pits, hidden stakes. Horses slipped, fell. Knights were thrown off their saddles. The Flemish didn't run. They stood firm, spears planted, Goedendags raised. When the knights reached them, the line didn't break. It swallowed them whole. Up close, the Goedendag proved devastating. Its long spike pierced armor. Its wooden shaft could crack bone. It was the weapon of the people, and that day, it brought down kings. The first wave of cavalry was crushed, but Artois didn't stop. Wave after wave of French knights crashed into the Flemish lines, The noise was deafening. Steel on wood, screams, mud flying, blood soaking into the earth. The Flemish held their ground. Every guild had its place. Every man knew his role. When one fell, another stepped forward. Artois grew desperate. He believed the tide could still turn, if only he could strike the heart of the Flemish line. So he rode in himself, at the head of the elite knights. It was a final, furious push, but the Flemish had been waiting. As Artois reached the center, he was surrounded, trapped in mud, surrounded by spears. He was dragged from his horse and killed. The French command broke. With their leader gone, panic spread. Knights turned, horses fled. The great army of France collapsed into chaos. The fields became a slaughter. Knights, unable to retreat in the narrow space, were picked off one by one. No mercy was shown. This wasn't just a battle, it was payback. By the end of the day, over 1,000 French knights lay dead. Among them, some of the most powerful nobles in Europe. The Flemish lost hundreds, but it was a clear, crushing victory. After the battle, the victors scoured the battlefield. From each fallen knight, they took a golden spur, the symbol of French chivalry. Over 500 spurs were collected. They were hung in the Church of Our Lady in Kortrijk as a message to the world. The age of knights was not invincible, and the people had won. The Battle of the Golden Spurs wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a statement, a rebellion, a declaration that power does not always lie with kings and knights, but sometimes with those who dare to stand and fight. Flemish townspeople, farmers, and craftsmen proved that even the common man can alter the course of history. Their spirit still resonates today, loud, proud, and unbroken. This spoken by a true Flemish YouTube creator. If this story moved you, taught you something new, or simply made you think, give this video a like, leave a comment below, and subscribe for more raw, unfiltered stories from the past. This was history without the polish. Just the facts, the fire, and the fight. Until next time.